In this video, we will see how to create a mini project using HTML, CSS, and PHP. First of all, you need to have the necessary software. To carry out the project, you need a browser, a code editor like Notepad++, and software that includes the Apache web server and the MySQL database management system. In my case, and in this tutorial, I am using XAMPP. I recommend using it. There are other software options like XAMPP or XAMPP that perform practically the same tasks as this software. We will start with our HTML code, then we will style our HTML document using CSS. After that, we will create a database in MySQL and create a table. Next, we will send data to this table and retrieve it using PHP. First, we need to create a new subfolder in the Docs folder, which exists under the installation folder of XAMPP, of course. If you are using the software I use, you should also ensure that the page is located in the correct Docs folder. This is necessary in order to execute PHP code later on. However, for the first part of this video, where we will create our HTML document and a CSS style sheet, this does not require software like XAMPP. However, since we will use PHP later, I will host all my files in the Docs folder of the XAMPP software from the beginning. Note that if you are using EasyPHP, you must host your files in the folder called www, unlike XAMPP where we need to host our files in the Docs folder. Here, I have created a new folder called Project in the Docs folder, in which I will create my files. I will create a text document here in this folder and name it index, then I will change its extension to HTML. Before start coding, we must ensure that all necessary XAMPP services like Apache and MySQL are started. Now, I will create a text document here and name it index. Here, I need to change the file extension to HTML. Now, we right-click on this file to open it with the Notepad++ code editor. Here, I will enter my HTML code. At the beginning, it's necessary to specify the type of document, so we use the doc type tag. Here, we will put HTML. Then, we need to open the HTML tag. Next, we open the head tag. In the head tag, it's best to add a title for your document. For the title, I will use registration, and I will close this tag. In the head tag, it's also recommended to add the meta-charset tag to specify the encoding. It should have the value UTF-8. Now it's time to create the body tag. In the body we will write the HTML code needed to display the visual elements. I will then close the tags I've opened. So, I close the HTML tag, and our document is ready. Now, we will take care of the visual elements. We will add a header, then a form and a paragraph. It's best to place a navigation bar inside the header tag. Here, I will create the header tag, and inside this tag, I will add a nav element. I create the nav element, and inside it, I will insert a list. To create a list in HTML, we use the alt tag to indicate an unordered list. So, I open the alt tag and then close it. Now, it's time to create the items for this list. These items should be created with the li tag. I open the li tag, and the first item will be home. I write home, then I close the li tag. I open another li tag for the second item, which will be news. Finally, I add a third li item with the text contact. I close all the tags, and there we go. We've finished our navigation bar. Next, we'll deal with the styling using CSS, which we'll cover later. Now, we will create our HTML form.
So, in order to create a form in HTML, we need to use the form tag. We open the form tag, and then we close it. Inside this form, we have a label containing name and a text box. So, I need to create a label tag. The label contains the word name. In front of the label displaying name, there is a text box, where the user has to input something. This is an input tag. Here, the type should be text. So input type equals text, which is an attribute of the input tag. It's best to add a bit of space, though it's not necessary. For example, in the placeholder, we can put your name. Then, we close the input tag. To create a line break, we use the BR tag. Now we will repeat the same process. We have a label containing the word, first name, and in front of it, there is an edit table text box. We will practically copy and paste. I will copy this and paste it here. I change it to first name. It's the same thing, except we need to modify the placeholder to your first name. Next, we have a label containing phone. It's practically the same thing, so I will copy and paste again. Here, we put the word phone. Normally, the phone number should be of type number. So, for the input type, instead of text, it's better to set it to number. In the placeholder, we put your phone number. Next, we have a label containing email and an edit table text box. We can copy and paste again. We change the label to email. The input type attribute should be email instead of text. Then, we have two radio buttons. The user must select only one option between two, not both at the same time. Here, it will be a bit different. I will copy and paste to save time. I put the word gender. Normally, each radio button should be of type radio. Here, I create an input type equals radio tag. We need to add a name attribute to this tag. For example, name equals gender. We also need to add a value attribute that will be sent to the database. Here, I will put male. For display purposes, this input tag does not include any text, so we have to add it ourselves. We can write male after closing the input tag. We will repeat the same thing before the BR tag, of course. I will copy this and paste it here. The type should also be radio, and make sure to keep the same name for both radio buttons, as they belong to the same category. This way, the user will only be able to select one of the two options. So, I change the value to female and modify the text to female. Now, all that remains is a button that displays submit. After the BR tag, I open a new input type equals submit tag. The value of this button should be submit. We close all the tags properly. Next, I will test my index file. To test it, I double-click, and it will open in the browser. Now, something is missing. We need to add a border around the form. This can be done using the field set tag. So, after the form tag, we need to add a field set tag. I close the field set tag before closing the form tag. To add a legend, we need to create a legend tag. Here, we will put the word registration in the legend. I close the legend tag. I save, refresh the page, and here's what I have so far. Now, we need to style this file using CSS. To style our HTML code, we need to use the CSS language. It's important to note that there are three types of styling for an HTML document: inline CSS, internal CSS, and external CSS. Inline CSS. This means the styling is applied directly to the HTML element within the tag itself using the style attribute. Let's take an example. Here, I'll create a border around an element using the style attribute. In this example, we use the CSS property border. First, I specify the thickness of the border. Here, 1 pixel. Then, I indicate the type of border, solid, for a continuous line. Finally, I define the color of the border, black. I save the file, and you can see the result. The first label, which contains the text, name, is now surrounded by a border. However, this type of styling isn't recommended for larger projects. This was just to show you what inline CSS is. Internal CSS, our task is to style the interface in a more organized way. So, I'll remove the inline style and create internal CSS. Generally, to use internal CSS, we insert the CSS code in the less than head greater than tag. Before it closes, we open a less than style greater than tag, then write the CSS code inside this tag, like this. Here, I've defined a CSS rule for all label tags, applying a 1 pixel black border to them. Finally, don't forget to close the less than style greater than tag after writing your CSS rules. To be able to style my HTML document, I need to use selectors. For example, if I want to apply styling to all the label tags in the document, I use a tag selector. Let's take an example to style all the labels in this HTML document. I use the tag name as the selector. In my CSS code, I will start by typing label. Inside the curly braces, I will specify the CSS rules I want to apply. Width, I want the labels to have a width of 20%. For that, I use the width property, like this, width, 20%. Display, I want the labels to be displayed in block mode while staying in an inline flow. In this case, I use the display property with the value inline block, display, inline block. Text alignment, I also want the text in the labels to be aligned to the left. For that, I use the text align property with the value left. Don't forget to end each CSS rule with a semicolon. Once you're done, save the file. When you refresh the HTML document in the browser, you will see that all the labels now have a width of 20%, are displayed in inline block mode, and the text is properly aligned to the left. I will now take care of the body element. For example, I want the body to take up 50% of the page. For this, I add the following to my CSS file, body width, 50%. After refreshing the page, you will see that the body now takes up half the width of the page. I want all the text in this document to use the Arial font. For this, I use the font family property. Here's how to add the CSS rule to apply the Arial font to the entire document. Font family, Arial, sans serif. After refreshing the page, all the text in the document will now use the Arial font. Margin, I will now add an external margin to the body element. The margin corresponds to the space outside the element. I add the margin property to give a spacing of 5 pixels at the top and bottom, and automatic spacing on the sides to center the content. Margin, 5 pixels auto. This means that the body will have an external margin of 5 pixels at the top and bottom, and the content will be centered horizontally using auto. After refreshing the page, you will see that the elements inside the body are properly centered, and the spacing is applied. I will now add a background color to my element. To do this, I use the background color property. You can also use background image if you want to set an image as the background instead of a color. Background color. In this example, I will use a hexadecimal background color, like £F for F4, background color, £F for F4. This will apply a light gray background color to the body element. Margin and padding. Next, I will add internal spacing, padding, to the body element. Padding is the space inside the element, between its content and its borders. Padding, 20 pixels. This means that the body element will have internal spacing of 20 pixels on all sides, top, bottom, left, right. Text color. I want all the text inside the body element to have a different color. For this, I use the color property, color, #1apt9c. The color #1apt9c is a teal shade. Rounded borders, border radius. Now, I will add rounded borders to a specific element, for example, a container like field set. This can be done with the border radius property. Here's an example to round the corners of a field set. Field set border radius, 8 pixels, text size, font size. I will also adjust the text size of a legend. To do this, I use the font size property, legend font size, 1 for M, margin bottom, 10 pixels. This sets the text size to 1.4 times the default font size, and adds 10 pixels of space below the legend. Finally, I will style the text fields, such as text, number, and email input fields, using CSS selectors to target them. Input type equals text. Input type equals number. Input type equals email. Border radius 5 pixels. Padding 10 pixels. Width 60%. Background color #FFFFFF. This adds 5 pixel rounded borders, 10 pixel internal spacing, a width of 60%, and a white background color to the text fields. Once the styling for the elements has been added, we need to check the display. Yes, I spotted a typo here. We should write number instead of number. The error needs to be removed. I'll save and test again. You can see that the elements are too close to each other, so it's better to add some space between them. I'm going to add a 10 pixel margin. I'll save. Now, That's much more spaced out and pleasant to look at. Next, I need to style the button. I'll start by positioning my button using the position property. I'll set position relative. Then, I'll add 20 pixels of padding to give some space inside the button. I'll use the font size property to adjust the text size inside the button. I'll set it to 18 pixels. Then, I'll define the button's border using the border property. I'll use a 1 pixel solid border and set a hexadecimal color. I'll also round the button's edges with the border radius property, for example, 5 pixels. Finally, I'll add some margin above the button with margin top, 8 pixels. I'll save and test. The button now has a proper size. And it's well spaced from the rest of the content. Now, let's move on to the navigation bar. In my HTML document, I have a nav tag that contains a list. For each item in this list, I'll add navigation links. For example, I'll create tags with the ref attribute pointing to another page or a website. I'll save and test. Now, the links appear correctly. It's time to style this navigation bar. I'll start by removing the bullet points from the list items using the list style, none property. Then, I'll add some padding, for example, 20 pixels, and set a background. I'll also take care of the elements. These elements need to be aligned horizontally, so I'll set display in line so they appear on the same line. I'll add 10 pixels of padding to each element. Finally, I'll style the tags inside these list items. I'll change the text color to white and add some padding to make them more visible. I'll also add some margin to space out the links. I'll save and test. Now, I have a horizontal navigation bar with well-spaced links. We can now move on to the PHP section. We mentioned from the start that, in order to create a dynamic website, you need an Apache server and a MySQL database. Both of these components are available in the XAMPP software. Here, Apache is running, and MySQL is also up and running. I will now create a database. So, I'll open FMyAdmin. From there, I can create tables and databases. I'll create a new database called project, and then I'll create a table named user with 6 columns. The first column will be the primary key, which I'll call id, of type integer, int, and auto-incremented. Then, I'll add a column for the name, of type varchar, with a length of 50 characters, a column for the first name, also of type varchar with a length of 50, column for the phone number, of type varchar with a length of 20, a column for the email, also of type varchar with a length of 100, and finally a column for the gender, of type char with a length of 1. Once the columns are defined, I'll execute the table creation. Now, I'll create a PHP file to handle the connection to this database. In my project folder, I'll create a file that I'll name connection.php. This file will contain the code to connect to the project database. I'll start by opening a text file, renaming it to connection.php. I'll then enter native PHP code, first opening a PHP tag with less than PHP and closing it at the end with greater than. The goal is to connect to the project database. I'll use the default user, root, which doesn't have a password. So, I'll write the following variables for the connection parameters. $host equals localhost, $user equals root, $password equals, $name equals, project. Next, to establish the connection to the database, I use the miscli_connect function. Here's how I write it. $con equals miscli_connect, $host, $user, $password, $name. Then, I perform a test to check if the connection was successful. If it was, I display connection table, connection established. Otherwise, I display an error message. If $con die echeck de la connexion miscli_connect_error, else echo connection table. I will test this connection file by accessing localhost project connection.php. If everything works well, the message connection table should be displayed. Now that the connection is successful, I'll move on to creating another PHP file that will allow data to be inserted into the user table. I'll create a new file called insert.php. In this file, I will include the connection file using the include function. Now, let's move on to including our connection file in insert.php. This way, we won't have to rewrite the connection code each time we need to access the database. In our project, we have already created a file named cnx.php that contains the code necessary to establish a connection to our database. To use this connection in insert.php, we'll use the include statement. Here's how we do it. First, I open the insert.php file, where we want to add the connection. At the top of insert.php, before we try to execute any database queries, we will include our cnx.php file. Here's the line of code to do that. Include connection.php. This line tells PHP to include the connection.php file at this point in the script. If connection.php is located in the same directory as insert.php, this path will work perfectly. When PHP processes insert.php, it reads the include statement and looks for cnx.php. It will execute the code in cnx.php as if it were part of insert.php. Now that we already have a file named index.php, we're going to add our HTML form directly inside this file. This form will allow users to input their personal details, which we'll later process using PHP. First, we'll open the index.php file and insert the form. The form will contain 5 fields: name, first name, phone number, email, and gender. At the bottom, there will be a submit button to send the data to another PHP file called insert.php. Now, let's add the action and method attributes to our form tag. We'll set it up like this: >form action equals insert.php, method equals post greater than action attribute. The action equals insert.php specifies that when the form is submitted, the data will be sent to the insert.php file for processing. This is essential so that our server knows where to handle the incoming data. Method attribute. The method equals post indicates that we want to send the form data in the body of the request, which is more secure for sensitive information like names and emails. It also allows us to send larger amounts of data compared to get. In summary, these attributes ensure that our form correctly submits data to the right file securely. Next, we need to add a name attribute to each input field within the form. The name attribute is essential because it acts as an identifier for the data being submitted. When we use the get method, the form data will be appended to the URL as query parameters. Each name will serve as a key for its corresponding value. Data retrieval. For instance, if a user enters their name in the nom field, we can access this value in insert.php using $_get nom. Without these name attributes, we wouldn't be able to reference or retrieve the submitted data effectively. Now, let's move on to the insert.php file, where we'll process the form data. This file will retrieve the data from the form fields using the $_get method, allowing us to handle the data sent from our form. The first step is to check if all the fields have been filled out. We'll use the isIt function to ensure each field is not empty. This is crucial because we want to make sure we have all the information before trying to insert it into the database. Once we confirm that all fields are filled, we'll store the data in variables. For example, we'll assign the values from the form inputs to variables like $num, $prenum, $telephone, $email, and $sex. Next, we'll write our SQL query to insert this information into the user table in our database. This query will follow the structure of an insert into statement, specifying which columns we want to fill with the respective values. Next, we will write our SQL query to insert the information we've gathered from the form into the user table of our database. This SQL query will follow the standard structure of an insert into statement. To explain further, an insert into statement allows us to add new records to a table. We need to specify which columns in the user table we want to fill with the data we collected, such as the user's name, surname, telephone number, email, and gender. For example, our SQL query will look something like this: insert into user, num, prenum, telephone, email, sex, values, $num, $prenum, $telephone, $email, $sex. In this statement, we list the columns we want to populate within parentheses after user, and then we use the values keyword to provide the actual data we want to insert. The variables we created earlier will hold the user's input from the form. Once we have written our SQL query, the next step is to execute it using the miscli_query function. This function is essential because it allows us to run our SQL command against the database. When we call miscli_query, we pass in two important arguments: our database connection and our SQL query. The function will then attempt to execute the query, and will let us know if it was successful, or if an error occurred. If the insertion is successful, we will display a success message on the screen, such as "Dais inseris of X6s." This feedback is crucial because it lets the user know that their data was saved correctly in the database. However, if there's any issue with the insertion, such as a problem with the SQL syntax, or a connection issue, we will catch that error using the miscli_error function. This function will provide a description of the error, which can help us diagnose what went wrong. Finally, to test the entire process, we will navigate to localhost project index.php in our web browser. There, we will fill out the form with the required information and submit it. If everything is set up correctly, and all connections and queries are functioning as intended, the data will be inserted into our database, and we will see our success message confirming that the operation was successful. Let's talk about a recent issue I encountered while executing my code, specifically related to the SQL insertion. During testing, I received an error message stating, "Errored insertion," or "failed to insert." After reviewing my code, I quickly realized that the issue stemmed from a missing parenthesis in my SQL query. In my miscli_query function, the SQL statement I wrote was supposed to insert values into the user table. However, I mistakenly forgot to close one of the parentheses. This oversight made the SQL syntax invalid, causing the database to reject the query. Once I identified this mistake, I corrected the SQL statement by adding the missing parenthesis, ensuring the syntax was correct. After making this adjustment, I executed the code again, and this time, it worked perfectly.